Forget the strike reels for a second. The real damage in this story is not the blast itself. It is what that blast says about everything Israel's firepower was supposed to have already solved. A missile from Yemen left a crater near Ben Gurion Airport, close enough to punch through the myth that distance still protects Israel's civilian front line. That is not a side note, and it is not just another siren. The moment a Yemen launch skies ground by Israel's main airport, the whole war stops looking like controlled escalation and starts looking like a breach. Now put that beside the other number set. More than 800 airstrikes and approximately 16,000 munitions. That is the scale of a military trying to dominate the battle space, not merely answer an attack. So if Yemen can still threaten Israel, after that much metal has already been thrown into this war, then the number is no longer the flex. The number becomes the indictment. And this was not some dead friend twitching back to life for one last headline. In March 2026, Israel identified a fresh missile launch from Yemen. The first from that arena since the current war erupted. That means the firing lane was not buried. It survived long enough to re-enter the war when the moment opened. If you're done with war coverage that counts, explosions and calls that understanding, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments what this really is. A missile defense failure, a deterrence failure, or proof that all this firepower is hitting hard, without ending the part of the war people actually fear. Here is the layer under the title. This is not one clean same-moment incident. It is worse than that. It is a strategic collision between three facts that should not be able to coexist so comfortably. A giant Israeli strike count, a proven Yemen pressure point near Ben Gurion, and a live Yemen launch lane still capable of re-entering the war. That is why people click this title so fast, not just to hear that Yemen fired something. They click because they want the forbidden answer to a brutal question. How can a state hit this hard and still not seal the route from a battered movement in Yemen to Israeli panic? That airport strike did not just mark concrete. It briefly halted flights and commuter traffic at Israel's main international airport and triggered panic among passengers. That is the kind of pressure smaller actors dream about, because it turns one launch into a national mood. Suddenly the war is not out there anymore. It is inside departure boards, family itineraries, missed flights, and exposed nerves. That is why the airport matters more than almost any warehouse, generator, or storage site. Later shown in retaliation footage. An airport is not just infrastructure. It is national confidence made physical. It is tourism, business, travel, evacuation logic, investor mood, and the public test of whether ordinary life still belongs to you. So when a Yemen missile reaches the psychological perimeter of Ben Gurion, the damage is larger than the crater. The crater is just the receipt. The real hit lands inside the Israeli promise that overwhelming force can keep the civilian rear feeling distant from the war. Israel's own response proves it understood exactly where the real pressure landed. The official line was simple. The Houthis tried to hit Ben Gurion Airport, and Israel responded by destroying the airport in Sana'a. That is not routine military language. That is airport for airport, gateway for gateway, symbol for symbol. Israel itself framed the exchange as a contest over national access and vulnerability. But this is where the official story starts, hiding the thing it cannot afford to say too clearly. Punishment is not deterrence. Blowing something up in response proves capability. Making the other side stop proves control. Those are not the same achievement, and this title exists because the gap between them may be widening. If punishment alone solved the Yemen problem, nobody would click this title. If pain automatically created submission, 800 sorties and 16,000 munitions would sound like closure. Instead, they sound like a giant question mark hanging over a war that still has not shut the lane people thought should already be shut. And nobody gets to soften this by pretending Yemen was left untouched. More than 20 Israeli fighter planes took part in the operation and dropped more than 50 munitions on dozens of targets. So this is not a story about restraint failing. It is a story about retaliation failing to produce the kind of fear that would end the behavior. That should disturb everyone watching this war closely. Once an enemy absorbs visible, expensive retaliation and still preserves enough launch capability and enough will to keep the front alive, the problem is no longer whether you can hurt him. The problem is whether you are hurting the part of him that actually decides whether the war continues. And maybe that is the ugliest answer hidden inside the title. Maybe Israel is not short of force at all. Maybe force is colliding with the wrong target architecture. Maybe the state is hitting what can be hit most cleanly, whilst The movement keeps protecting what matters most: dispersal, survivability, willingness, and the ability to turn endurance into theater. After the airport strike, the Houthis said they would impose a comprehensive aerial blockade on Israel by targeting airports. You do not have to believe every word of that literally to understand the intelligence inside it. They were telling you where they think leverage lives. Not in outmatching Israel's firepower, but in repeatedly threatening the arteries of movement, visibility, and normal life. That is how a weaker actor cheats the math. It does not need to flatten cities. It does not need air superiority. It does not need to win on tonnage platforms or sustain damage. It only needs to keep proving that after every display of Israeli dominance, the route from Yemen to Israeli anxiety remains open one more time. And once that happens, the title's numbers start turning against the side that used them. The bigger the retaliation, the harsher the contradiction if the threat still survives. At a certain point, the strike count stops sounding like reassurance and starts sounding like evidence that scale is not getting to the mechanism that governs the enemy's choices. One line slices through the fog. Defensive action only has not deterred their escalation. That matters because it destroys the easy fairy tale that enough interceptions plus enough punishment will eventually teach. The lesson: against an enemy like this, survival is part of the message. Every launch after every strike says the same brutal thing: you can hit us, but you still have not governed us. That is why the title feels so violent in the gut. The audience is not just hearing about one missile, they are hearing that the stronger side's preferred script may be failing. They are hearing that a state can dominate the sky and still not fully own the consequences below it. And that is the point where normal TV coverage usually collapses into noise. It starts stacking statements, casualty counts, and strike footage, as if the accumulation of military activity is itself an answer. It isn't. Activity is not resolution, destruction is not closure, heat is not control. Here is the colder diagnosis. The Houthis appear to lack a center of gravity that can be successfully targeted by Israel. That one idea changes the whole story. It means the familiar coercion formula may be smashing visible infrastructure without truly striking the decisive core that would force the movement to recalculate. If that is true, then every retaliation can be tactically impressive and strategically incomplete at the same time. That is the nightmare hidden in plain sight. A military built for rapid, overwhelming, visible domination may be facing an adversary built to survive exactly that category of punishment. Not stronger in total force, not richer, not cleaner, just structurally different in the way it absorbs damage and converts survival into relevance. And once you accept that, the title stops sounding like provocation and starts sounding like diagnosis. Israel can fly the sorties. Israel can fire the munitions. Israel can hit what is seen. But if the launch chain still lives, then force is not yet reaching the place where this war actually ends. None of this means Yemen is acting in a vacuum. The Houthis could not operate at this level without Iranian arms, training, and intelligence. But there is a second edge to that same warning. Direct command over every move remains unclear. That ambiguity is exactly what makes this front so dangerous. It is supported enough to stay lethal, but not simple enough to reduce to one remote trigger somewhere else. That ambiguity helps everyone on the other side of Israel. Iran gets pressure without always carrying the full visible burden of execution. The Houthis get prestige as the surviving arm still able to throw a punch when other fronts are constrained, degraded, or overcommitted. And Israel gets trapped in the worst argument possible. Every strike can be justified, yet the threat remains alive enough to prove the justification did not solve it. So no, the real problem is not that nobody is responding. The real problem is that response and resolution are drifting apart. That is why the audience clicked. They already sensed that the official story and the battlefield reality were no longer moving at the same speed. And this is not some tiny nuisance front, inflated by one dramatic image. Since October 7, 2023, the Houthis have launched a combined total of around 1,000 munitions at Israel, international shipping, and the forces defending commercial vessels. That number kills the lazy idea that Yemen is just tossing sporadic disruption into the region. This has been a sustained pressure campaign with endurance, adaptation, and strategic intent, which means Ben Gurion was not a freak miracle. It was the moment the broader pattern touched a symbol everybody understands. Long campaigns become politically real when they hit something woven into normal life. That airport gave the Yemen front exactly what it needed. Proof of reach that ordinary viewers do not need a military map to understand. And once that proof exists, every future launch gets heavier. Even interception-heavy outcomes can still impose psychological cost, because now the public knows the route is real. They know the path exists. They know the front is not abstract. And that knowledge changes the emotional geometry of the war. That is why the harshest line in this whole story hangs there like a blade. Despite sustained airstrikes on Yemen, the movement has only gotten bolder, exposing Jerusalem's weaknesses. Even if you resist the full sweep of that claim, the surviving record of launches and threats keeps feeding it. A proxy does not need to defeat Israel outright to expose a weakness in how Israel thinks deterrence should work against this front. And the weakness is not softness. It is not hesitation. It may be something far more humiliating than that. It may be that overwhelming force is colliding with an enemy specifically built to survive the kind of force being delivered, and then use that survival as propaganda, legitimacy, and proof of endurance. That is how you end up with a title like this. 800 sorties sounds like domination, 16,000 munitions sounds like closure. Yemen missile still reaches Israel, takes all that expected finality and snaps it. Over one ugly reality, the side with more aircraft and more bombs still has not fully closed the lane that matters. And once a stronger state fails to close that lane, the consequences travel far beyond one missile. Allies start asking what massive retaliation actually buys. Enemies start learning what kinds of pressure remain survivable. Smaller actors across the region start studying the same lesson. Maybe you do not need parity to stay dangerous. Maybe you only need to remain politically alive after the punishment that was supposed to finish you. That is the real blast radius of this story, not just a crater by an airport road. Not just a fresh launch from Yemen. Not just a giant Israeli strike summary. The blast radius is the possibility that the war is teaching everyone in the region a poisonous lesson about how to resist a stronger state. Do not try to match it. Endure it. Survive its most visible answer, then prove one more time that the route to its fear is still open. So let's answer the central question cleanly. What does it mean when Israel can dominate the sky, fire 16,000 munitions, and still face a living missile threat from Yemen? It means military effort and strategic closure are no longer the same sentence. It means the test is not how much damage Israel can inflict. The test is whether that damage closes the firing chain and restores the public feeling that the rear is no longer reachable. If the strongest reading of this title is true, then the message is brutal. Even after extraordinary Israeli firepower, Yemen can still push a missile threat into Israel's strategic bloodstream. If the narrower reading is true, if some of the latest effect is more about persistent reach, alarms, and political pressure than spectacular damage, the deeper conclusion still survives. Because either way, the launch chain remained alive after punishment that was supposed to silence it. That is why the audience came, and that is why the title works. Not because it is loud, but because it names the contradiction people can already feel in their bones. Massive force has been used. Massive force has been displayed. Massive force has not delivered the clean psychological closure the public expects when a state says it is settling accounts. In the end, the most dangerous proxy is not always the one that wins the biggest battle. It is the one that survives long enough to turn your greatest display of force into proof that the war is still not obeying your script. Stay close, because this channel tracks the part of war that survives the strike footage and exposes what power still could not fix.